Welcome to ILTV Insider. I'm Aaron Porras, and today we'll be taking a look at the United Nations. What is the role of the UN today? Is it fulfilling its founding mission? And if not, what does the future of this world body look like? Joining us to discuss is former Israeli ambassador to the United States and former deputy minister to the Prime Minister's office, Michael Oren, and then columnist for Newsweek and editor of HistoryCentral.com, Mark Schulman. Thank you both very much for being with us. Now, to begin, we face a case of vivid deja vu, where once again the United Nations Human Rights Council singles out Israel for 5 separate condemnations on the June 2020 sessions. And as watchdog group UN Watch notes, the resolutions are one-sided and ignore Israel's basic rights to sovereignty. Meanwhile, only one critical resolution each was adopted against abuses in Iran, Syria, and North Korea. China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and others, some of the world's worst human rights abusers, go on ignored completely. Now, Michael, Ambassador Oren, I want to start with you. What do you make of this continued pinhole focus on Israel within the context of the United Nations' own mission, i.e. the maintenance of peace and security worldwide?
Well, it's not often known in my resume. I began my diplomatic career as an advisor to Israel's mission to the United Nations. This is quite a long time ago. But things weren't much different back then. There's an automatic majority and that assures that Israel is condemned more frequently than all other nations in the world combined, including some of those stellar nations that you yourself mentioned. And it's not going to change. It's built into the system. And perhaps the UN does some good elsewhere. But pretty much anything to do with Israel and our situation in the Middle East, the UN is at best harmful and at worst dangerous to Israel, because these resolutions can then serve as exhibits in efforts to boycott us, sanction us through international criminal courts.
I see. Mark, what's your take on this? And what is the UN really capable of doing?
Okay, I think we need to separate that out into multiple layers. Look, the original purpose of the United Nations in the end of World War II was to try to ensure there's world peace after World War II, that there shouldn't be another world war. In the same way the League of Nations was established for the same purpose. The UN was given additional powers and theoretically was stronger than the League of Nations. And of course, the United States was the founding member as opposed to a country that didn't join it with what happened in the League of Nations. Look, overall, the United Nations established the State of Israel. Let's not forget that. It's the United Nations resolution that created the State of Israel way back when in 1947. That there's an automatic majority in the United Nations against us. Generally speaking, that's the case. And primarily, it's the case many countries that actually have reasonable relations with us will vote against us because they know it doesn't really make any difference. And I agree with Michael. It's problematic in the sense that it creates resolutions that are on the public record. But I think when you look at the United Nations, we can say that, yes, they've done some problematic things vis-a-vis us, especially agreeing, this goes all the way back again to 1949, 1950, when the United Nations established the Palestinian refugee system, which was the only refugee system in the world that did not allow the resettlement of the refugees in new countries. Yeah. And so, that was the original sin of the United Nations vis-a-vis us. But the reality is, of course, the United Nations is much more than the Middle East conflict. It's still the only place where the nations of the world actually meet. It's the only place where there's some sort of body for interaction, for exchange of scientific materials, for political materials, and all those sort of ways. It still acts as a umbrella organization, even in terms of the environment and all these other areas. I think we have to understand that we're in a unique position. We have to accept the fact, at least for the moment, and for the foreseeable future, that it will not be a friendly organization towards us. But on the other hand, most of what it'll do against us will be rhetoric only, because even those voting against us, at the same time, they vote against us and they trade with us. They vote against us and they sign agreements to improve tourism or anything else of that nature. So it's two-sided when it comes to that. So I think you need to divide, when we look at the United Nations, between how it relates to the Arab-Israeli conflict and how it relates to us. In that sense, that narrow sense, in that sense, it's really terrible, and it has been terrible since 1967. I mean, we can go into the reasons, but since 1967, from the time that the Soviet Union turned against us fully, it has been bad for Israel almost, repeatedly. The only reason it hasn't been terrible is the United States has a veto in the Security Council, and the Security Council is the one part of the United Nations that actually has some teeth.
Well, so again, I want to bring it back to you, Ambassador. where are the UN's failings and limitations then? Because again, we have this issue that Mark touched upon here, where the bodies that make up, the members that make up the world body have certain agendas, and they say one thing publicly and they do something and they do another thing privately. Where does that fit in terms of world diplomacy and action?
Again, it sets precedents. It sets legal precedents, and insofar as our struggle with the Palestinians and others has moved into a legal and diplomatic phase, even more than a military phase, where our enemies see the primary means for denying us the right to defend ourselves, and ultimately the right to even exist as an independent Jewish state, then actions in the UN have a material and substantive ramification. It can be used, quite frankly, can be used as ammo against us. But it's not just that. The UN is involved on the ground here. Let's not forget it. And Mark made reference to 1967, the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF in Sinai, the 1956 war, which the UN condemned us for, was precipitously moved by Nasser in May 1967 off the Six-Day War. So the peacekeeping forces work when there's no actual peace to keep. United Nations Emergency interim force in Lebanon, created after the 1978 Batani operation, with its mandate renewed after the 2006 Second Lebanon War, has, under its auspices, literally under its nose, enabled help to acquire 50,000 rockets and place them in 200 villages in southern Lebanon. There are observers in Jerusalem who are observing the first truce from the 1948 war between us and Transjordan. They're doing an excellent job. We haven't broken that truce. There are UN forces in Sinai that are observing the 1949 armistice with Egypt, because the UN does not recognize the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, doesn't recognize the Jordanian treaty either. Okay, this is the UN. UNDOF, United Nations Emergency Disengagement Emergency Force in Syria, was placed there in 1974 after the Yom Kippur War. Because there's actually no fighting there, but the fighting had during the Civil War. UNDOF simply. So there's a tendency in the world, and it was during my experience in Washington also with the Obama administration, wanting to put more UN forces on the ground here, say to separate Israel from the Palestinians. It's a very dangerous situation for us. And the UN creates the impression that it can actually advance peace. But even on the ground, it can't do that. It generates a situation where it sort of lays the groundwork for the next war.
So Mark, bouncing off of that, a common criticism in the UN's democratic framework, again, is that in a majority rule model consisting of some of the world's worst human rights abusers, despots, and dictators, creates a situation where it cannot possibly do what's best for all mankind. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, look, we have to look at the democracy index in the world that's gone down in the last 5 years. At some point, maybe 10, 15 years ago, we were sort of believing that most of the countries in the world would be democracies, and maybe those things would have changed. But that's obviously gone backwards in the last 5 years or 10 years, and there are less and less democracies than there were back then. There's a baked-in majority against us, there's no question. But again, when I look at the United Nations, I look at the United Nations versus Israel, or an Israel-Palestinian question on the one side. And I think almost in every case when we look at that, other than the establishment of the state, they've done more damage than good in our case. And then I look at all the other things the United Nations does, and I think it's somewhat a different picture. There are other problems, no doubt, but they've played important roles at different periods. And once again, let's get back to the ultimate question. The one body that has the power to actually use force is the Security Council. And the United States, primarily, sometimes with Great Britain and others, has used their veto power 96% of the time, or whatever, 98% of the time, in order to block anything that would really be detrimental to us. So we have to look at it in both ways. When it comes to symbolically, yes, the United Nations is always bad for us. And I agree, yes, it creates some sort of legal precedent. It's not at all clear how strong that precedent is legally and how binding it is legally. It's a different and new area of international law, but the reality is it's not good for us. But overall, we can't say the United Nations should disappear because it still does many, many good things. And it is the only place that exists in the world today where all of the countries in the world meet, interact, hopefully avoid war. I mean, let's look at it the other way. The United Nations was created in 1945 after the greatest world war, the greatest world war in history, World War II. After the League of Nations failed to stop World War II, and the League of Nations didn't try to stop it, was created after World War I. And since 1945, we're now at 2020. Thankfully, I won't say it's because of the United Nations, but there has not been anything close to a world war since then. And there have been, if we look at the statistics, less and less wars taking place in the world over the last 30 years. And that's good. Is it the United Nations it's responsible? Probably not. There are all sorts of other reasons. But on the other hand, that was the reason it was established. And facts speak for themselves also.
All right.
I'll just, if I could, Mark, I'll add one interesting story from my recent experience with the UN. A couple years ago, when Nikki Haley was the U.S. ambassador, she convened the Security Council to discuss terrorist activity against Israel, aggression against Israel. And I was in the Knesset at the time, and I just out of curiosity, I wanted to find out when was the last time the Security Council had met to discuss aggression against Israel. Of course, it met innumerable times to discuss aggression or alleged aggression by Israel. And my staff at the Knesset delved into this. They went back 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50, 25 years. And the answer, when was the last time the Security Council met to discuss aggression against Israel? The answer is never.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't argue this point. We both agree the fact that when it comes to Israel, the United Nations has been more than a little problematic. Let's put it that way.
I think Eliza doesn't live up to its own definition of anti-Semitism, which is signaling Israel out. And in my political positions, I had no problem with suggesting to my American counterparts that maybe they should move UN headquarters out of New York City, that a city that is a center for Jewish life shouldn't be host to an anti-Semitic organization.
Well, that I disagree with. I think it's still whatever influence the United States has over the United Nations, which is still not inconsequential. Certainly, it's diminished during the Trump administration. I think it increases by having it in New York, and I think it's a good thing for the United States, and it's a good thing for the UN ultimately to be in New York. But that's a different issue.
Well, let's talk a little bit about President Trump and the United States' role, because President Trump has pulled the United States out of certain UN councils and organizations, most recently announcing the pulling out of the WHO, arguing that they've been tainted by Chinese pressure in the fight against coronavirus. UNRWA, as we mentioned earlier, the UN Palestinian Refugee Organization, and the World Heritage Center, UNESCO, have also come under fire for politically based or politically motivated declarations over the years. So, how do you keep these international bodies honest? Is it like the United States does by pulling out money and pulling out funding? Is it with sanctions? Is it with NGOs?
Well, look, my view is you stay in and use your money to try to leverage it as much as you can. But listen, President Trump's policy has been America first and pulling out of almost any international agreement that exists. He sees an international agreement and he thinks it's bad, automatically. We won't talk about the Paris Climate Agreement or anything else. He'll pull out of any sort of international agreement he can, including arms agreements with Russia at this point. Things would make no sense because there's no follow-up to what comes afterwards. So my view is you engage, especially if you're the United States and you have that, budgetary ability to influence bodies. You use that as much as you can. You have experienced and good diplomats there, and you're not going to get your way most of the time, but you'll get your way more by being engaged in part of it than walking away from the table. Generally speaking, I'm against walking away from any table because it makes great headlines, but it doesn't really accomplish a lot when it comes to day-to-day management and influencing day-to-day policy.
Ambassador?
I categorically disagree. I think the engagement historically, not just with Israel, but going back, to the Munich agreements, going back to America's dealings with Russia and China, engagement backfires. A couple of years ago, you had a president of the United States that was willing to sign a nuclear agreement with Iran on the hope that it would make Iran into a productive regional power, and it completely backfired. And that was precisely the case in the UN. George Bush withdrew America's ambassador from the UN Council for Human Rights, even though it had condemned Israel, again, more frequently than all other countries combined in the world. He did it in large measure because he perceived the UN Human Rights Council as an anti-Semitic organization. The Obama administration came and restored that ambassador with the claim that we can engage the UN Security Council for Human Rights, Council for Human Rights, and we can influence and leverage our influence by being involved in it. Well, guess what? The UN Council for Human Rights condemned Israel even more. And fortunately, this administration has withdrawn its ambassador, and I applauded that as a member of Knesset. Engagement almost overwhelmingly simply gives an imprimatur to anti-Semitism, to aggression, and has exactly the opposite impact. Again, it's not just Israel's experience, it's world experience. And the fact that the United States participates in an organization, for example, like UNRWA, simply legitimizes the historical, financial, and political outrage that was UNRWA. And the fact that the United States has pulled out of it was a good deal. I'm not a spokesman for the Trump administration. They had reasons for pulling out of the Russian deals. They had Russian deals for pulling out of a number of organizations. America is partnered and signatory to thousands and thousands of organizations in the world which the United States hasn't withdrawn from. Yes, some of them they have. But in farms of the UN, I can't think of a single example where America's withdrawal has not redounded both to the benefit of the United States and of the state of Israel.
So that kind of leads me to my next question. Is it worth pulling out of the UN? Is it worth remaining in the UN for Israel and for other countries like Israel or the United States?
Well, I really don't understand even the option of pulling out of the United Nations. What's to be gained? It'll make great headlines. It'll be great for some Israeli politician to say we pulled out of the United Nations. The reality is, once again, I fundamentally disagree with Dr. Oren in the sense that I do believe in engagement. I do believe it's a positive thing. Israel needs to be at the table. Israel needs to say what it believes in. It needs eloquent spokesmen at the United Nations that people to hear and listen to. And even if they don't follow what he says, our voices needs to be heard. And I think it's important, and it's important the United States has eloquent representation in the United Nations. Once again, it doesn't mean that our voices will be listened to. It doesn't mean that we'll get our way, but at least our views will be heard. If we were not a member of the United Nations, Prime Minister Netanyahu would not be able to go once a year and speak to the world from the podium of the United Nations. And people listened. Did they follow what he said? Well, they didn't follow what he said, but they listened, they heard, and I think that's very important. And I think it's important that we keep on doing that. I think it's important that we have eloquent spokesmen. Again, this is not a job for amateurs, in my opinion. The job of the United Nations ambassador, not to mention the job of the American ambassador, are jobs for people who really know what they're doing. And I'm not talking about good politicians. I'm talking about eloquent people who have a historical understanding of their roles. And I think that's very, very important. I think it can have an impact. It certainly can have an impact in public opinion. Remember, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations gets interviewed by all the channels in the United States, by the major broadcasting networks. He's one of the spokesmen who speaks for Israel because he's Israel's ambassador to the UN, sitting in New York. So these are important roles. They're important in terms of public opinion, in terms of propaganda. And I strongly believe we have to continue engaging, even if the end result isn't that we sway anybody in any strong sort of way. But it's important to be there. It's important for public opinion. It's important to have the presence. And the presence is always important.
So, Ambassador, final question off the back of what Mark just said. What do you see in the future for Gilad Erdan, who was just nominated to be the new ambassador for Israel to the United States and to the UN simultaneously? Can he do both of these jobs effectively?
He could do all 50 jobs simultaneously. The question is, what do you expect from the job? As Mark knows, Eben was ambassador to both the United Nations and the United States back in the 1950s, early 60s. Did an excellent job. The world has changed since then. The UN position in particular is an unusual one because it has two sides. On one hand, it's probably the easiest job in the Israeli political diplomatic world, in the sense that the UN meets for basically 3 months every year. You give a few speeches. You don't have to deal with communities. You don't have to deal with the media if you don't want to. You don't have to deal with the Jewish community. You don't have to do outreach to churches and African-American communities. You don't have to do anything. You don't. You could show up for a couple of votes. You don't have to show up for a couple of votes. There's no written contract that says you have to do any of the things that Mark mentioned. However, It is one of the great platforms in the world. It is a platform for talking to the American people, talking to the world community. As a platform for reaching out to all areas of the Jewish community in the United States, which, as you know, is very fractured right now. To the African American community at a critical time, the Latino community. There are so many things you can do with that position, but to do that, you have to be dedicated and you have to be able to do it full time.
Mark, any final response?
Yeah, well, that's the answer. I mean, it's an absurd situation to have someone to have both those jobs. To compare our new ambassador to Abba Eban is a little bit of a stretch, to say the very least. And I think, again, we need full-time people in both those jobs, in my opinion. And we need the best people we possibly can in both those jobs, not the most appropriate person for the political needs of the prime minister at the moment. And again, we go back to the discussion we had off air. We need to have our best people at the jobs that they are doing. And it's one of the failings of the Israeli political system is we don't get our best people. And I'm not talking about ideologically right now, but the best people within any ideological camp to take the job that they're most suited for. And that repeatedly happens, and it's happening again in terms of the ambassador to Washington and the ambassador to the United Nations, and both together, which to me is completely absurd. But that's besides the point.
All right, but unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. Thank you again, Mark Schulman and Ambassador Michael Oren, for joining us. And tune in next time on Insider for more in-depth analysis on everything Israel. Also, if there's a topic that you want us to cover next, please let us know in the comment sections online. Finally, remember that for more news from Israel, follow ILTV on Facebook, like us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV channels. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.